Hello everybody, this is Dr. Aparna and today we are going to read a poem called When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. This poem was written by Walt Whitman in the year 1865. The year 1865 is a very important year in the American history. That was the year when President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and this poem is written on him. Walt Whitman wrote many other poems on Abraham Lincoln after his death, but this has become very famous. Now, this is considered as an elegy. What is an elegy? Elegy is a poem written in the memory of a person who has died. And this is also called as a pastoral elegy because it has a rural background. This poem has a rural background, and in a pastoral elegy, we talk about a shepherd. The shepherd here is the American president, Abraham Lincoln, because after his death, Walt Whitman has written this poem on his glory. He has written this poem about his glory. He has written this poem about the grief that people have felt after the president was assassinated. So in a way, Abraham Lincoln was a shepherd who guided the people of America, who understood the political landscape of America, and who realized the importance of the abolition of slavery around that particular point of time. But then not many people liked his views, not many people admired him for the political stances that he took, and that is the reason why he was eventually assassinated. A poem on Abraham Lincoln. This is an elegy written on Abraham Lincoln. Why does the poet use the word lilac? What does he mean by lilac? What is a dooryard? A dooryard is a backyard. And in his backyard, whose backyard we are talking about? We are talking about Walt Whitman's backyard, where lots of lilacs are blooming. And lilac is a flower that blooms all across the length and breadth of America. It is a sign of brotherhood. It is a sign of unity. It unifies the people together. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed. Why does he say last? Because of the death of the president, he feels that perhaps this is the last time that the lilacs will really bloom so beautifully. Let us now understand the historical background, the circumstances under which this poem was written. Now, in the 19th century, the American continent was politically divided. The northern states were free states and the southern states had slavery prevalent in them. There was a bloody civil war which lasted from 1861 to 1865. They fought the war for one reason, and what was the reason? The abolishment of slavery. The southern states never wanted the slavery to be abolished, whereas the northern states were vehement about it. They never wanted slavery in their country. The Africans were bought from Africa and they were made into slaves. The southern region of America is very fertile, especially for cotton cultivation. They needed people to work in these cotton plantations. So the people were brought from the African continent and they were made as slaves and they were made to work. It was not that slaves were ill-treated. Not all the slaves were ill-treated. Slaves were also looked after well in the southern states. But nevertheless, it was a policy matter and they wanted slavery to be abolished. And so there was a bloody civil war during this time. And finally, under the able guidance of Abraham Lincoln, slavery was abolished. But then John Wilkes Booth, who was against the policies of Abraham Lincoln, assassinated the president on April 14, 1865, when the president was watching a play called Our American Cousin. It was the third act of the play when Wilkes shot him behind his head. Of course, the president was wounded fatally and he died on April 20th. He was kept in the capital till April 20th, and later on body was taken across the breadth of North America and to Springfield, Illinois, where he was given a burial at the Oak Ridge Cemetery. The poem was written after the death of Abraham Lincoln. Walt Whitman, who looked up to the president, who was a friend and who felt that the president was the right man to lead and to govern who felt that Abraham Lincoln was a brave man who had really led the war, the Civil War, and had really brought justice to the people of America, was deeply saddened by his assassination. And after his death, after his assassination, Walt Whitman wrote this poem, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. Let us now understand more about, let us now know more about the poet Walt Whitman. Much of Walt Whitman's life is enveloped in mystery. He was born on 31st May 1819. He came of English and Dutch and Quaker ancestry. His father was an Englishman and his mother followed Quakerism. He lived in West Hills, Long Island, which is almost the border of Dutch and English colonies. His father, Walter Whitman, was a builder. He was also a free thinker, he was a farmer, and most importantly, he was a democratic. His mother, on the other hand, belonged to the family of Quakers. What is Quakers? They believe that every human being has an inner light, and this inner light should be followed and should be adhered to, should be listened to. It is a duty of every human being to listen to this inner voice. Walt Whitman was highly influenced by his father's democratic ideas, mother's Quakerism, both of which left an indelible mark in his mind. Walt Whitman also came in touch with Emerson. Emerson, as we know, is called as a sage of Concord. He is a man who spoke about life, man who has written a lot about nature, about life in his essays and in his poems. Walt Whitman, through Emerson, came to know about Thoreau and Alcott. These people taught him about transcendentalism. What is transcendentalism? Transcendentalism believes every human being has an inherent goodness in him, both, and this is something which human beings must realize, and this is something what the transcendentalists believed in, that we all have something inherently good in us and we should exploit what is good in us for the welfare of the others. In the year 1855, Walt Whitman brought out his first volume of poems called The Leaves of Grass, wherein he spoke about America, he spoke about the American ideals, he spoke about the American terrain, he spoke about the beauty of the country, he spoke about the thought processes. Whatever he spoke, it reflected about what people thought in America. Therefore, we can say that Walt Whitman is the representative poet of America. He is a man who truly represents the country. He is also called as a poet laureate of America. He claimed that while he was voicing his thoughts, while he was voicing his emotions, while he was talking about his feelings, he was at the same time reflecting the thoughts and feelings of his countrymen. Let us understand the poem. The poem is a 16-verse poem. So, we will understand the poem section wise. I am going to take up four verses at a time. Now, Walt Whitman wrote this poem, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, in free verse. It does not have any metrical pattern. For example, one line may be short, it may just have 7 syllables to it, and another line may have around 20 syllables to it. So, Walt Whitman is not really following any metrical pattern, and as I said, he has written this poem in a free verse. Now, first let us understand the first 4 stanzas of this poem. The first 2 stanzas, the poet actually introduces the basic structure of the elegy. In the first 2 stanzas, he is talking of the grief. He is talking about the death of Abraham Lincoln. He is talking about the season spring. He says that he is sitting, and there in front of him the season of spring, where he sees lilacs blooming, and there in the west there is this star that is actually drooping in the western horizon. This star represents Abraham Lincoln, his beloved leader and friend. The lilacs, the drooping star, and the spring are a trinity which would always remind him of his beloved hero Abraham Lincoln. The fixed position of the star, as I said earlier, the star represents Abraham Lincoln. The lilacs represent the grief that the poet is feeling, and there is also a bird which is the hermit thrush, which represents spirituality in this poem. So the fixed star in the horizon is actually Abraham Lincoln. The fixed position talks about what? The fixed position talks about the steady relationship that Abraham Lincoln has with his country. The steady relationship with Abraham Lincoln has with the people of his country. The harsh sounding cloud represents the grief that is felt by the people of America on his death. The lilacs that bloom every spring represent what? They represent the eternal memory of the president that is there in the mind of Walt Whitman. And as I said, the hermit thrush, the bird, represents spirituality. So the first two stanzas talk about this. In the next two stanzas, the symbol of the lilac is explained in more detail. It is further developed. The poet plucks this lilac flowers and hopes to place it on the coffin of Abraham Lincoln. He hopes to share his grief with his countrymen. Thus, the lilac becomes a symbol of love, it becomes a symbol of sympathy, it becomes a symbol of grief, which is shared by all the people of America. Lilac, as I said earlier, is a flower that grows in the length and breadth of the country. It is easily available for people, it is available to all sections of people, and therefore there is a sense of brotherhood, there is a sense of bringing people together. The lilac symbolizes that. It symbolizes people coming together, equality, equanimity, it symbolizes brotherhood. So the hermit thrush, which is a voice of spirituality, is singing a song of bleeding throat. If the hermit thrush is not allowed to sing, it will die. The song of the hermit thrush is equated to the song of Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman says that his song is death's outlet song of life, and he is singing this song for his beloved leader Abraham Lincoln. So this is what is the essence of the first four stanzas of the poem. Sections 5 and 6 describe the journey of Lincoln's coffin across the country. It journeyed night and day through streets, lanes, cities, farms, fields, and the whole of North America mourned at the death of Abraham Lincoln. People were dressed in black, women were dressed in black, the flags were brought down, they were in half mast, they were lowered. The bells of the church tolled because they wanted to show their solidarity and love for their president. The poet placed his sprig of lilac over the coffin of Lincoln. The poet's grief is thus universalized. As the whole nation mourns along with the poet because they have lost their great president Abraham Lincoln. In sections 7 and 8, the poet says that the poem is not just a poem of mourning, but it is a song of death also. He says that he would offer the sprig of lilac not only to his beloved president, but also to all the soldiers who have died in this civil war. He calls death as sane and sacred, but the poet is unable to understand the real nature of death, and that is what causes a lot of sorrow to him. He is unable to come to terms with the fact that Abraham Lincoln is no more. He mourns for it. The hermit thrush tries to talk to him about spirituality. The hermit thrush tries to talk to him about the reality, but he is in no mood. His state of mind is such whereas he does not really listen to the song of the hermit thrush. In the same stanza, he talks about this drooping star, which actually foretold the imminent death of Abraham Lincoln because it was full of woe. These are the words that he uses in the poem. The drooping star was full, it was full of woe because it knew that the country would face an imminent loss. The country would face the death of Abraham Lincoln. Now the poet understands that the star actually foretold the death of Abraham Lincoln. In the next two sections of the poem, the poet again hears this song of the hermit thrush, but then he is unable to understand it. He is unable to go to it because he is detained by the star. He is detained by his love for the president. He is detained by his sense of mourning. He is unable to come out of his sorrow. He is unable to come out of his grief. He is unable to come to terms with the reality that the president is no more. The star which symbolizes Lincoln is what holds him back. The hermit thrush would want to explain to him the essence of life and death. The hermit thrush, as I said earlier, represents spirituality. The hermit thrush wants to tell him that life is a cyclic process, that life and death are a part and parcel of every human being. But Walt Whitman is in no mental state to listen to what the hermit thrush is wanting to tell. So he is held back by the star. He is held back by the grief that he faces because of the death of Abraham Lincoln. As I was telling, there is this tension. Now, the poet wants to stay back and look at the star. He wants to stay back in his grief, whereas the hermit thrush is asking him to come and listen to its song. He is not really attracted to the song of the hermit thrush. The poet, on the other hand, also does not know what kind of perfume he should offer to the coffin of Abraham Lincoln or Abraham Lincoln's grave. He decides that the winds that come out of the sea, that blow from east to west, combined with the breath of his song, would be an apt perfume for the president's grave. Let us now move ahead to the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th and 15th sections and understand what the poet is trying to tell us in these sections. In the 11th and 12th sections, the poet describes the kind of pictures that he would like to place in the burial house of Lincoln. He says that he would like to place the pictures of the American prairies. He would like to place the picture of farms, of spring, of sweet herbage, of rivers, of workmen coming out of factories. In all, he wants to put the picture of America in Lincoln's burial place. He wants to show the people, he wants to show the readers, he wants the people to realize that Abraham Lincoln really represented America, and that is the reason why he wants the burial house, the burial place to be surrounded with the pictures of America. He was America's leader, and the poet suggests that he would live in the hearts of the people forever and ever. In section 13 and 14, the poet returns back to the swamp from where he really started, and he comes to listen to the poem of the hermit thrush. The song of the bird is expressive of the poet's pain. It talks about the poet's emotion. It talks about the poet's grief. It sings about the poet's emotion. It sings about the poet's grief. He wants the bird to continue singing, but is held back again by the drooping star. He stays there, but then he listens to the song once more. Finally, in section 14, the hermit thrush attracts him with its song, and the poet realizes the importance of life and death. With his thoughts of death and with his knowledge of death, the poet retreats into the swamp where the hermit thrush was singing. The song of the bird welcomes death. The song of the bird teaches Walt Whitman that life is a continuity. When a person is born, it is imminent that he dies. So he comes to terms with the death of Abraham Lincoln. At this point of time, he starts thinking about the many people who have died during the bloody Civil War that took place from 1861 to 65. The poet therefore glorifies death, and he joyously starts singing about the song of death. The last two sections of the poem, the poet gets a mystical insight into the nature of death. After hearing the song of the hermit thrush, he understands the concept of death. He understands that death is imminent and one cannot escape it. He understands that his personal grief for Lincoln and visualizes the thousands of people who have lost their lives in the Civil War, who were killed and are now at rest. He feels that those who have fought are better than those who are surviving, because those who are dead will definitely not remember. They are at rest, they are at peace. But whereas who survive and who feel the loss of those who have died are the real sufferers, are the real people who are suffering, are the people who are really in pain. The lilac, the star and the bird have a chant in his soul. It is a cyclic thing that has happened. He starts with the star, he goes to the lilac, he goes to the bird and comes back to the star again. He comes back to the star knowing a lot more about death, realizing and understanding a lot more about death. So as I was telling, this poem is a pastoral elegy that was written after the death of Abraham Lincoln, where Abraham Lincoln is equated to the shepherd, took the country through the times of difficulty and finally brought in some justice for the black slaves in America. So he is definitely a leader to really look up to. His death really shook the nation, and he was assassinated in the year 1865, after which Walt Whitman wrote this poem. This poem has a lot of symbols, as I was talking about. The western star is Abraham Lincoln. The static position of the western star states that Abraham Lincoln's steady relationship with his country. The lilac represents the grief that Walt Whitman felt after the death of Abraham Lincoln. This grief is shared by all the people of America. And then, of course, the hermit thrush, the bird that sings the song of spirituality and makes the poet realize the importance of life and death. So that the poet comes to terms with the death of Abraham Lincoln. It is a beautiful poem. It is a poem about death. I'm sure you people must have read a lot of poems on death. I'm sure you must have read a lot of elegies in your life. I'm sure you must have faced this kind of situation in your life. What have your reactions been? Have you felt bad? What has gone in your mind? Have you been attached to people so much that their loss has really crippled your mind, that your heart has really felt the pain at the loss of people whom you have loved? People are born to die. These are the ultimate realities and truths of a human life. Every person who is born has to die. There is nothing called immortality. There is nothing like living forever. I wish that were possible, and I don't think anybody would really wish to live for 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years, and 1,000,000 years. Death is imminent. We cannot escape that, and death is something which has to be accepted by all of us. Just as we accept the birth of a child, we must accept the death of a human being. This elegy is written on the death of Abraham Lincoln. So this actually can be closely related to our personal lives also. What is literature? What is poetry? Poetry reflects life. Literature reflects life. It talks about things that are happening around us. It talks about people who are really around us. It makes us aware of our situation. It makes us aware of our times. It makes us aware of the people whom we are living with. Literature brings out that nuances of life. I hope you have enjoyed listening to this poem as much as I have enjoyed teaching it to you. Thank you.